dawn of a fatal day, and the wind begins to speak with a roar that no man can fail to hear.
On a windy Thursday morning in 1940, just 4 months after the legendary Tacoma Narrows Bridge was opened to the public, people started noticing that it had started swaying pretty visibly across its length.
In a 40-mile-an-hour gale, the feather span weaves like a ribbon in a swinging twist.
As the swaying became more dramatic, officials blocked all oncoming traffic just in time before a cable buckled under and the bridge literally started rotating across its axis.
The 11,000-ton feather span twists and strains the giant...
If you've seen the videos, I'm sure you'll agree that it looks so surreal, it's hard to believe that it's not some sort of CGI.
There it goes!
At 11 a.m., one of the longest, most beautiful bridges in the world collapsed into the water below. It was a moment, much like the fall of the Titanic, that went down in textbooks as one of the most colossal engineering failures in history. Fast forward 60 years. Engineers thought they'd figured it all out, and the Millennium Bridge was built in London, UK. But soon after its opening, it seems to be having the same problem. So what exactly was going on here? This is Tethered Minds by Amna Heather. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the science of synchrony. This doesn't just impact bridges, but it plays a huge role in our daily lives in ways we don't even understand. There is a remarkable beauty to synchrony. Our brains wouldn't exist if it weren't for millions of neurons firing in step. Our hearts wouldn't pump if it weren't for a coordinated action of millions of little heart cells. Synchronizing with others, it's allowed us to accomplish everything that we have so far. But we're going to see what happens when synchrony goes wrong. How in the wake of this new era, it's increasingly tearing us apart. And how it can break bridges. When you're looking at bridges, there is no better place to look than London. London is famous for them. And that's why, at the start of a new millennium, the country decided to fund a new bridge. One that was meant to be the icon of a century. The Millennium Bridge was a stunning collaboration between prestigious architects, artists, and engineers, and it was opened to the public on June 10, 2000. But it really made headlines around the world when it was closed just 2 days later.
What happened was a mystery. No one really understood why this happened. Bridges were thought to have been well understood.
That is Dr. Daniel Abrams, an applied mathematician who not only helped crack the case about what happened to the Millennium Bridge, but also how the mystery behind it could surprisingly explain some of the most important patterns in our social world.
So the engineering firm did some experiments where they had people walk back and forth between two cones on the bridge in groups of 10. They would start with 10 people, and they'd be measuring carefully the acceleration of the bridge with instruments, and then they'd try 20 people, and they'd try 30 people, and they'd be watching acceleration. It's nothing serious.
40 people, 50 people, 100. Still no movement. But when they went from 150 people to 160, there was a sudden switch.
They saw it went from stable to unstable and started oscillating.
Okay, so I'm going to give a disclaimer here. This particular episode starts with a slightly unconventional approach to understanding social psychology. Some very cool physics. If that isn't your thing, please bear with me. We won't use any numbers, equations, or complicated words. And I promise that by the end, my favorite corner of physics might be yours too. So there's a couple basic things we need to know. The first is that absolutely nothing in the universe is still. Every single thing, even the things we think must certainly be still, are wiggling. Just a tiny bit. Dr. Abrams likens this movement to the more obvious movement of a grandfather clock.
It has a natural speed, a natural time it takes to go left, right, and back to the left if it's swinging. And that's how grandfather clocks keep time. That's how traditionally all pendulum clocks keep time, because that's such a regular, predictable pattern of oscillation with a very accurate timing.
It turns out that the same way a pendulum on a grandfather clock moves at its own consistent beat, a bridge is also always vibrating at its own microscopic, consistent beat. But to understand how this microscopic beat became dangerously powerful, Dr. Abrams took this knowledge and he coupled it with something else, something we've all observed in a child's playground.
Say you're pushing a child on a swing. If you try to push them when they're not there, when they're not all the way back, if you're standing behind them, you're not going to be pushing empty air. You're not going to give them energy. They're not going to get going. But if you push with the right timing, every time they reach that limit of their swing in the back, you're going to pump energy in.
And that beat is what scientists call a resonance frequency.
It has a specific timing that's associated with getting energy into the system. And every structure has a resonant frequency or multiple resonant frequencies that will allow you to add energy to the system, and in the case of a bridge, perhaps destroy it if too much energy goes into it.
I don't know if you've ever pushed an adult on a swing before, but it's pretty easy. You don't have to apply a lot of force to push someone pretty high, but you have to apply that force to the right beat. And the same is true for bridges. Like a swing, a bridge has a certain frequency that it likes to move at.
When you design a bridge, you can predict what these frequencies are, mostly based on the length of the span and the stiffness of the material that the deck is made from and the tension in the support wires.
To get a bridge to move, you don't have to apply a lot of force. It just has to be applied at the right frequency. In fact, that's exactly what happened with the infamous collapse of the Tacoma Narrows. It had been made to withstand all kinds of forces. You could fill the bridge end to end with massive trucks of granite, and it wouldn't budge. But ultimately, what caused it to collapse was gusts of wind.
So it didn't happen on that bridge when the wind speed was much higher than the day it collapsed. It had been through much higher wind days, but it happened when the wind speed was just right to cause resonance with the bridge structure's natural instability.
When wind blows, it often cycles around a bridge at some predictable speeds or frequencies. That fateful Thursday in 1940, like every other day, the Tacoma Narrows was wiggling at its own microscopic natural frequency. But at some point, the cycles of the wind synchronized with the frequency of the bridge, and the wind started pushing the bridge, just like you might push someone on a swing, higher and higher until... After the Tacoma Narrows collapsed, people started to design bridges so that they wouldn't be sensitive to gusts of wind. So that's why, when the Millennium Bridge in London started swaying, people started to wonder, could the bridge be synchronizing with something else? And that's where Dr. Abrams came in. He was intrigued by the odd behavior of the people on the bridge that seemed to be unintentionally moving in sync.
The key insight here that bridge engineers have had for years is that people walk typically about 2 footfalls every second.
Up and down, up and down.
And bridge engineers, when they're designing bridges, they know to avoid that frequency.
2 beats per second.
Because if a big crowd goes over it, you're probably going to get a lot of forcing at that frequency.
And when he says avoid, he means
you can tune which frequencies they're most likely to respond to and get excited by it.
This has been well understood for years. It's why soldiers have been told to break stride when they cross the bridge.
Left, right, left.
So the Millennium Bridge was already designed so that it wouldn't be sensitive to 2 beats per second. But something that had never been considered before, and one that Dr. Abrams confirmed through his mathematical models, is that when people walk, they not only push up and down, but they also push, just a little bit, side to side. For every 2 up and down, there's 1 cycle, side to side, that our footsteps take.
And that,
1 beat per second.
it turns out, was very close to the natural frequency of one of the spans of this bridge. Before this, people did not think about that as a dangerous natural frequency for a bridge.
This was a small beat, dangerous enough to break the bridge of a century. I want to stop for a moment just to appreciate this concept of resonance. You'd expect that if you want something to move, you have to put an equal amount of energy in. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts. That's what our basic intuition tells us, and also how scientists and philosophers thought the world worked for so many years. Ultimately, it wasn't that the bridge couldn't handle the weight that was on it. It just couldn't handle the beat of the footsteps. When things synchronize in just the right way, magic happens. And there's a precise moment in which it does. When bridge engineers experimented with people crossing the bridge,
They would start with 10 people, and they'd be measuring carefully the acceleration of the bridge with instruments, and then they'd try 20 people, and they'd try 30 people, and they'd be watching acceleration. It's nothing serious.
but when they got to 160 people, suddenly the whole bridge started moving.
Yeah, that's the most surprising phenomenon, and the one that's hard to see without math. In a lot of these systems, what you have is called a phase transition. We use that same description for explaining how water turns into ice or turns into steam. There's a change in its phase. And mathematically, the theory we developed shows a phase transition where you go from a bridge being nearly perfectly stable to suddenly having significant levels of oscillation. And there's a critical transition there at some number of people at which that happens. Why intuitively do phase transitions occur? I've never heard a great intuitive explanation, but this is a widespread phenomenon in nature throughout physics, chemistry, and engineering, that phase transitions can occur in complex systems.
If you're a Harry Potter fan, you might remember the living portrait of the fat lady who tried to break a glass with her voice.
Amazing! Just with my voice! Amazing.
Well, tune up Major.
Yes, all right. Go in.
Thank you.
While she had to cheat a little, there are people who can do this. How? Well, like everything else in the universe, a glass also vibrates at a certain frequency. When you make a sound that matches with that frequency, the glass starts vibrating more and more until it hits some key transition point and shatters. But it's not all just things breaking. Synchrony can be quite beautiful too.
So one thing I have an interest in at the moment is fireflies. There are these things called synchronous fireflies.
And, like normal fireflies, they start with random firing, each firefly chaotically flashing on its own. But suddenly, there's a stunning phase transition.
And they will synchronize their flashes so the whole bush or even a whole riverbank will be blinking on and off, flashing in unison.
This symphony of light creates such a spectacular display that fishermen can use it to guide their way back home. And it's so surreal that in the 1500s, when the explorer St. Francis Drake returned home with tales of these synchronous fireflies, no one believed him. And even up until the 20th century, there were scientists that were convinced that the flashing was some sort of optical illusion. Not much has been known about them until recently.
It's one of these charismatic species, and if you care about conservation, it's a great ambassador species that you don't want to see disappear. And I'm part of a project that is going to go do some new recordings of the fireflies in their home base.
Okay, wow. So you're going to see hundreds or thousands of these fireflies flashing in perfect synchrony. Do you think that there's some great firefly leader out there that's setting a rhythm for everyone else? Or do you think that the synchrony just somehow emerges on its own?
This is exactly what we want to know the answer to, so I don't know. May or may not have experienced this where people can start clapping in sync, right? You can get a beat going without a leader. You don't need someone to set the tone for clapping. If everybody just decides we're going to clap in sync, you start with kind of cacophony, and then within a few seconds, really, a few claps, everyone gets into a rhythm that's emergent. So without a leader, it can definitely happen. But it could be happening with a leader. Maybe there's some unknown leader that we don't understand.
Okay, I'd love to use that thread of human clapping to move on to a conversation about synchrony between humans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I would call this social synchrony, I think, what you're asking about. How do people, not within your body, but across multiple people, agree on something? And so I think these problems of social synchrony exist across many timescales. There's this timescale of like human evolution.
And in one problem, Dr. Abrams decided to look over hundreds of thousands of years to answer a question of human-handedness. And he asked,
how is it that about 90% of people are right-handed and about 10% left-handed? In my mind, it's a synchrony problem. So it seems like we've reached an equilibrium where we've all kind of agreed to be right-handed in an evolutionary sense, but yet some small fraction of left-handers persist.
Okay, so if I may, I'm going to try to guess where you might be going here. So does sharing the same handedness serve some sort of an evolutionary purpose? Like allowing us to share tools?
I think you hit the nail on the head, figuratively and appropriately, by talking about sharing tools. So I think that's a key aspect of why we have handedness, or at least at a group level in humans.
Okay, so can you see differences between different populations in the fraction of right-handed people?
There is some evidence that the fraction left-handed is higher in hunter-gatherer societies where rates of interpersonal violence were higher. The name this goes by is the fighting hypothesis, the idea that left-handers have an advantage when fighting, but in most other situations they're at a disadvantage because they can't effectively share tools.
Right, so the idea being that fighters would do better if their handedness was different. Have you done any studies to explore this?
So when I worked on this, we looked at sports as a model system because obviously you can't do experiments with evolution, but you see drastic overrepresentation of lefties in many sports where they have this sort of fighting advantage, the surprise advantage. They've practiced, the left-hander has practiced a lot against right-handers in their career, but right-handers don't get to practice against left-handers much. So that gives them, in general, a big edge.
Archaeological evidence from bone density and types of tools shows that 10% of humans have been right-handed for about 500,000 years. But at one point, that wasn't the case.
In many animal species, it's about a 50-50 split on lefties and righties.
Like other animals, it's likely that at some point our predecessors were equally likely to be left or right-handed.
During evolutionary history, there was a selection for right-handers in times and in situations where cooperation was important, and in times when competition or physical confrontation mattered, then lefties had an advantage. So this 10%, I think, represents a balance between those two. And you can make a mathematical model also in the spirit of synchrony and show that the symmetric solution would be stable when you don't have too much cooperation. When you have a lot of cooperation, it becomes unstable, and you, again, a type of phase transition where you end up with a majority one-handed.
But it's not just handedness to share tools. Our brains have an innate blueprint for social synchrony. This structure is called the mirror neuron system. I studied this myself in grad school by scanning two people's brains at the same time while they interacted with each other. It might sound like science fiction, but this is real science. There's been multiple studies where they do this. Take two people and scan their brains simultaneously while they talk to each other or play a game. And what's been shown over and over is that when people cooperate, each person's mirror neuron system starts to fire in sync with the other. This system lays the groundwork for all sorts of human synchrony. So I asked Dr. Abrams about what this human synchrony could look like.
Sure. I'll give a couple of examples. So there are ways in which humans synchronize, like on the Millennium Bridge, people synchronize their footfalls without consciously trying to do so. When people walk, it's mostly an unconscious activity, but you tend to synchronize your speed also with people walking nearby on a sidewalk, for example.
But then there's another level of synchrony. And this is where an entire population starts to adopt the same thoughts.
So this goes by different names. In social sciences, sometimes it's called the consensus problem. How do people reach consensus? You can think of that consensus as an opinion on a political issue, for example. But it can also be consensus on like a language spoken in a region. Like, why do the native people of this particular area of this country speak? How did they end up speaking the same language?
Think about it. Languages change over time. New words are added to the dictionary nearly every day, and definitions change of old ones. Definitions change when they're used differently by enough people.
Cambridge Dictionary updated its definition of a woman to include anyone who identifies as female, regardless of their sex at birth.
And new words get added to a dictionary when enough people start using them.
Okay, it's hard to keep up with the new lingo of the current generation, right? Well, now you can turn to your dictionary for help. Merriam-Webster just added hundreds of new words, including sus, which is short for like suspicious or like suspect, janky, slang for something of poor quality, something that, I said in 1995, but, everything will...
There is no appointed leader that decides how languages will change over time. It emerges on its own by mass consensus over an entire population. We see synchrony everywhere. Whether it's people synchronizing on the words we use, or a bridge synchronizing with footsteps.
All these things can be seen as synchrony problems, where you may or may not want synchrony, you may want consensus, you may not. But understanding how it emerges, I think, is a real challenge of the day.
Okay, if you aren't impressed by any of this so far, it might be because synchrony is so deeply embedded in our daily lives that it's hard to appreciate its beauty. But if you take a class in physics, one of the first things you're taught is that the universe tends towards disorder. It's known as the third law of thermodynamics. When you drop a piece of glass and it shatters, you can't put it back together. Physical systems don't naturally go from chaos to order. This is why synchrony is so beautiful. In a universe that becomes more and more disordered, there are so many examples of where things go spontaneously from chaos to an ordered synchrony. And if we want more order, we need to understand how this works. Right after the break, we'll talk about how this concept of synchrony can help us make sense of and potentially fix the political polarization that we're seeing all around the world.
I think there is a lot of overlap in the mathematics that's used to describe synchrony and the math that's used to describe something going viral.
Welcome back. We're exploring how groupthink comes about and the tipping point that sets it off. Just like the emergence of synchronized clapping, there is a transition point for when something goes viral. The renowned author Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote an entire book about just this, described it in an interview.
The tipping point is the word that comes from study of epidemics. It's to describe that moment in the epidemic when it explodes, when the moment of critical mass. And if you look at every epidemic, there is always that moment when the curve suddenly shoots up very sharply and dramatically. And so understanding how you can get to the tipping point is the critical question when you're looking at something that's contagious.
Gladwell was particularly interested not in how viruses spread, but how ideas and actions could spread between humans.
I talk in the book about the word yawn. If I say the word yawn long enough, you will start yawning. And
exactly.
People watching a show will start yawning. That's an incredibly contagious word.
According to Gladwell, there are a few factors that influence whether or not something becomes popular. The first is called the stickiness factor. And this represents the ability of something to capture our attention and be passed on. We need to defer to some social psychology to understand what types of things are sticky. So we spoke to the author and social psychologist, Dr. Dominic Packer. He shared that when it comes to social media, we are drowned in information throughout the day. And he spent a lot of time looking into what types of things capture our attention in this flood.
Yes, that's right. So lots of research is ongoing in this regard. So for example, there's a statistic we cite, which is that on average, it seems that smartphone users scroll through social media on their screens something like 600 times a day.
So 600 scrolls.
And if you assume each screen is on average about 6 inches tall,
what that means is 300 feet of information a day.
Which translates to the height of the Statue of Liberty, which is kind of large, right?
It's huge. It literally means that every single day, on average, we scroll inch by inch all the way up the height of the Statue of Liberty.
And so then you have to ask, all right, well, in this vast stream of sort of onslaught of information, what do we pay attention to?
And so Dr. Packer's co-author decided to look at over 500,000 tweets with certain keywords.
And what they're finding, which is super interesting, is that there's a certain class of word called moral emotional words, which tend to attract attention very quickly, but also be more likely to be shared and to spread more virally.
In other words, they have a high stickiness factor.
And moral emotional words are not just emotional words like happy, sad, and they're not just moral words like good and bad. They are the combination of both. They're words like disgusting, hate.
These are people that hate our country. They hate our country, I think, with a passion.
Terrible.
You are a rude, terrible person.
Sort of things that have this moralizing component, like they're judging people as often bad, but it could be good in some cases, but also have this really strong and viscerally emotional response. Like, that is absolutely disgusting. And it turns out that tweets or Facebook posts that contain more of those words tend to be more likely to spread through networks.
Each moral emotional word increases the chances of a tweet being shared by a whopping 17%. These words are sticky.
Which, of course, you could imagine isn't necessarily the best thing, right? That you get these feedback loops where people who want messages to go viral are probably not consciously, but have sort of learned over time that if you use more of this sort of language, it's more likely to spread. And so they end up using more of that language, which means that more of those sorts of messages indeed go viral, and you get this spread of toxicity throughout social networks.
In fact, almost to prove their point, one of the students in this lab posted a tweet made up entirely of these moral emotional words.
Attack, bad, blame, care, destroy, fight, hate, kill, murder, peace, safe, shame, terrorism, war and rob.
And it was retweeted almost immediately over 600 times. What's even worse, negative words are more sticky than positive ones. One study looking at tweets and Facebook posts by US Congress members had shocking results. They found that negative language increased the number of shares by 45% for each word, while each positive word actually decreased the number of shares by 2 to 5%. But it's not just stickiness alone that allows you to predict whether or not something goes viral. It matters where and when it happens. Malcolm Gladwell calls this the power of context. What goes viral in one place might not in another. And the groups we find ourselves in affects us a lot.
The other thing they found is that most of that spreading occurs within in-groups. That is, when they analyzed how much things get retweeted, for example, by Democrats and Republicans, what they find is that Democrats tend to retweet other Democrats and Republicans tend to retweet other Republicans, and you don't get a whole lot of cross-fertilization in any sort of productive way.
This means we are stuck in echo chambers, with our own voices synchronizing with that of our group members. And as for the type of content we see, Dr. Packer told us about the stickiness of moral emotional words and negative language. This allows social media to become the perfect incubator for hoaxes. Because to the algorithm, all that matters is how much attention something gets, not how true it might be.
And the general pattern is that people again seem to be less skeptical of information that reflects positively on their group and reflects negatively on an outgroup, especially in a competitive context like politics.
In the 2016 US elections, news circulated that the Pope endorsed Trump. But the exact opposite news, that the Pope had actually endorsed Clinton, was also being shared. It turns out he didn't either.
A recurring internet story says Pope Francis endorsed Hillary Clinton. But is it true? I traced it back to KYPO6 News. That's a fake news site. They also reported that the Pope endorsed Trump. Again, not true.
You could make the argument that perhaps we believe these things to be true because it's all we see in our echo chambers. But what's worse, when we're exposed to information that attempts to correct these beliefs from outgroup sources, that can actually cause people to retreat more firmly into their hateful, false beliefs. Dr. Abrams has used this phenomena in his own mathematical models.
People have mostly an inclination towards consensus, so you might tend to change your view to be more in alignment with the opinion you just heard expressed. But maybe if it came from the opposing party, you might not change your opinion as much, or it might even backfire. If the information you get from an outgroup source is so different from what you currently believe, it might cause you to move your political viewpoint in the opposite direction. So this is called a backfire effect, and it's been recently documented in some experiments via Twitter.
Moral emotional words are sticky. They go viral even when the content is a lie, and trying to rectify it by exposing people to other sources often causes them to retreat even further into their own groups. We end up in echo chambers, synchronizing with our own groups and moving further away from others. So it's hard to even start to understand the views of those outside our groups.
I think both those things are happening, that not only are we more likely to be repelled by opinions we encounter on Facebook or other social media, the opinions that we encounter are not representative of the population as a whole, but they're already more extreme than the typical person holds. And so it leads to this situation of echo chambers and feedback of negative opinions that each person finds maybe needlessly outrageous or repulsive.
In the real world, to go viral, information would have to largely travel through word of mouth. But on social media, virality is engineered. Algorithms pay close attention to content that gets engagement and give it a boost.
Things spread that are likely to stick. Things go viral when they reach a tipping point. And I think that's one of the big problems with social media, is that negativity and conflict are so much more likely to spread.
Okay, so this social psychology is definitely very cool. But Dr. Abrams, how do you, as a mathematician, incorporate this social science into your own work?
We look for fundamental mathematical models that seem to capture key aspects of human behavior.
And what's your goal with these models?
So I think the mathematicians can be useful in terms of understanding and quantifying these fundamental responses. But then it moves into other territory of like, how do you address this? Once you have a mathematical model, you can try out theoretical solutions like de-emphasizing posts that are disproportionately polarizing. You could imagine emphasizing only things that engage both in-group and out-group in similar ways.
This is a space where policymakers, social psychologists, and mathematicians can come together.
Whatever the specific policy is, I'm not sure what the right policy is and whether it would be conceivable that it could be implemented. But if you have a mathematical model that at least captures some fundamental aspects of human behavior, that gives you the opportunity to test in the computer what the result of different policies would be, and it motivates trying out some policies over others.
Every day, researchers like Dr. Abrams and Dr. Packer are working on trying to figure this stuff out, to create a more positive outcome from this innate human impulse to synchronize. There is a delicate dance to the synchrony between us, and so much is unknown about the tipping point that sets it off. For better or worse, just like the synchrony of our footsteps on a bridge, our collective power is greater than each of us alone. We can let that destroy us, or we can harness it to our advantage. But it's only in understanding how it happens that we can hope to steer the ship. That's all for today with Tethered Minds by Amna Heather. By the way, I just started this podcast, so if you like what you hear, please share and subscribe. It means a lot. Next month, we'll be talking about everything nostalgia, from its bittersweet history and its fascinating psychology. As we deal with COVID, climate change, and social distress, these days, uncertainty feels like the only certainty. And many argue that nostalgia is the emotional pacifier that many of us are falling back on. The renowned researcher, Dr. Clay Routledge, will walk us through how we can use nostalgia to better our physical health and emotional well-being. And Dr. Anna Stefaniak will share the fundamentally social nature of nostalgia and how many politicians use it as a political tool to get support for their platforms. We'll see you next episode.